Bro, you won't believe what happened to me one night. It was supposed to be a chill Friday with my best friend, Danny. We were just hanging out, laughing, nothing special. Then, my stepmom, Diana, walks in, looking different, acting different, and let's just say things got intense fast. Ever been in a situation where you can feel something happening but can't stop it? I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop it. I'm not saying this is a story I'd normally tell, but it's one you'll want to hear till the end. It started out as an ordinary evening, but nothing could have prepared me for the events that would unfold. I was just hanging out with my best friend, Danny, in the living room. We were chilling, laughing about nothing and everything, just passing the time like we always did. The next thing I knew, my world was turned upside down. Everything changed when my stepmom, Diana, walked into the room. Now, Diana was 45, confident, with this magnetic presence that always drew people in. Lately, I had noticed something different about her. She seemed to know exactly the effect she had on people. Maybe it was her new haircut, her choice of clothes, or maybe it was just how she carried herself. But tonight, she had a certain something in her eyes, and Danny noticed it too. I could see his gaze follow her across the room, lingering, like he was seeing her for the first time. "Hey, boys," she said, her voice smooth and inviting. She was holding 2 glasses of wine, one in each hand, her silk robe slipping casually off one shoulder. "Mind if I join you?" Danny and I exchanged a look, a mix of shock and excitement. We were both speechless. I mean, what could we even say? We were 18, and this was completely out of nowhere. But, like a moth to a flame, we were drawn in. Without saying a word, she settled in between us on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body next to mine. "You two look like you are having fun," she said, with that easy smile of hers, handing us each a glass of wine. As she crossed her legs, her robe shifted ever so slightly, revealing just a hint more of her leg. I could feel the tension building, a strange, almost electric feeling in the air that neither Danny nor I could ignore. For a few minutes, we all sat there, each of us stealing glances at one another, caught in this unspoken tension. And then Diana broke the silence, her voice low and inviting. "I have noticed how you two look at me sometimes," she murmured, a smile playing on her lips. I felt my face go red. I could see Danny squirming in his seat, too, his eyes darting between her and me. "You do not need to feel awkward about it," she said, letting one of her hands rest gently on my knee. "I find it flattering." She let her fingers trail down my leg, sending a shiver up my spine, and I glanced at Danny, whose face mirrored my own shock and disbelief. Diana shifted slightly, leaning forward, her hand moving from my leg to Danny's, tracing small circles on his knee. "Relax, boys," she said in a low, soothing voice. "We are all adults here." I could hardly breathe, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. Here we were, sitting in silence with the woman I had grown up calling my stepmom, yet in this moment, she felt like someone entirely different, someone I did not even recognize. "Diana," I started, but my voice trailed off, the words refusing to come. She looked at me, her eyes bright and unreadable. She leaned closer, her lips only inches from my ear. "Let us stop pretending," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. "I know you have thought about it, both of you." She tilted her head slightly, meeting Danny's gaze with a knowing smile before looking back at me. My heart was pounding, every nerve on edge. Danny looked at me, as if searching for reassurance, but I did not have any answers for him. All I knew was that I was frozen, torn between the thrill of what was happening and the voice in my head screaming that this was all wrong. But as Diana's fingers traced up my arm, all logic slipped away, leaving only the charged silence between the three of us. Then, she leaned over to Danny, her lips brushing his neck. I could see the way his eyes fluttered closed, his breathing shallow as her touch traveled down his chest. My mind reeled, but I was mesmerized, caught in the spell she was weaving. I knew then that this was a moment we could not take back, a line we were all about to cross. She kissed him softly, her fingers grazing his jaw, and he let out a soft, involuntary gasp. I could see his hesitation fading, melting away as he leaned into her touch. Then she looked over at me, her eyes dark and intense. "What about you, Jason?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur. Her hand shifted to my thigh, her touch featherlight. The question hung in the air, and in that moment, I realized I wanted this just as much as Danny did. I did not answer her with words. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips meeting hers in a hesitant, testing kiss that quickly deepened as I felt her hand tighten on my thigh. The next few moments were a blur of kisses, touches, and whispered words. Diana moved effortlessly between the two of us, her touch igniting a spark in me that I had never felt before. It was like she knew exactly what to do, guiding us both as though this was the most natural thing in the world. I had no idea how long we stayed that way, the three of us tangled together in the warm glow of the dimly lit room. It was exhilarating, overwhelming, and terrifying all at once. The minutes felt like hours as Diana moved between us, her touch growing bolder, her gaze never losing that spark of mischief. The tension in the room was so thick I could barely think straight, and every time her hand brushed against me, my breath hitched. Just as I was getting lost in the moment, she leaned back, her eyes meeting mine with a knowing smile. "You boys really are something else," she whispered, her voice low and sultry. She glanced at Danny, her hand still lingering on his arm. "You have both grown up so much." Danny looked at me, his expression a strange mix of thrill and disbelief. None of us knew exactly where this was going, but at this point, it felt like there was no stopping it. Diana shifted, letting her hand slip from Danny's arm as she stood up, her robe falling just a little more open. She looked over her shoulder, an invitation clear in her eyes as she walked toward the stairs. Without saying a word, Danny and I followed her, the thrill of the unknown making every step feel electric. When we reached her bedroom, she paused, turning to face us with that same teasing smile. "Are you too sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft but serious, giving us one last chance to back out. My heart pounded, and I could see Danny was just as conflicted as I was. But as I looked at her, standing there with that look of expectation in her eyes, I knew I could not turn back. "We are sure," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She smiled, satisfied, and guided us inside, closing the door softly behind us. The room was dimly lit, casting a warm, inviting glow over everything. Diana turned to us, her robe slipping slightly as she moved, revealing just a hint more of her figure. She stepped closer, her fingers tracing a light line down my arm, then Danny's, her touch sending a shiver through me. "Then let us stop pretending," she murmured, her gaze flicking between the two of us. She guided us over to the bed, her movements smooth and confident, each touch and glance making it clear she knew exactly what she was doing. I could feel the tension building, my heart racing as her hand found mine, her fingers intertwining with mine for just a moment before moving to Danny. Diana's lips brushed my neck, soft and warm, and I felt my skin heat up. Every touch felt like a spark, igniting something inside me that I had never felt before. I was hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every glance exchanged between the three of us. Danny and I exchanged a quick look, a silent confirmation that we were both feeling the same way. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing now. We were all in this together, and whatever came next, we would face it as one. Diana guided us, her touch light yet deliberate, moving between us with a practiced ease that made me wonder how long she had thought about this. It was as if she knew exactly what each of us needed, her touch sending waves of heat through me that I could feel spreading with every heartbeat. Hours passed in a blur of touches, whispers, and stolen glances. Diana led us both, her touch never losing its intensity, her gaze filled with a desire that only fueled my own. It was exhilarating, intoxicating, and I was lost in every second, feeling like I was in a dream that I never wanted to wake up from. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, Diana lay back, looking at both of us with a contented smile. She reached out, touching each of our arms, her expression soft and satisfied. "You boys were incredible," she whispered, her voice filled with a warmth that made my chest swell. I could see the same feeling reflected in Danny's eyes as he looked at me, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had shared in those few intense hours. For a while, none of us spoke. We just lay there, catching our breath, letting the reality of what had happened sink in. I was too caught up in the moment to think about what it all meant, but a part of me knew that this was a night that would change everything. The lines had blurred, and there was no going back. Eventually, Diana stood up, reaching for her robe and tying it loosely around her waist again. She looked back at us with a knowing smile, as if she could read every thought running through my head. "I think we all needed that," she said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. As Diana disappeared into the bathroom, leaving Danny and me alone, the weight of everything that had just happened settled in. I felt like I was suspended between disbelief and exhilaration, my mind still racing with the memory of her touch, her whispers, the way she had looked at us. It was hard to believe that any of it was real. Danny sat up beside me, running a hand through his hair, his eyes wide as he looked over at me. For a second, we both just sat there, neither of us knowing quite what to say. There was this unspoken understanding between us, but at the same time, it was like neither of us wanted to be the first to bring up what had happened. "So, what now?" Danny finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shrugged, still feeling that heady rush of adrenaline in my veins. I do not know," I admitted, meeting his gaze. Do we just go back to normal?" Danny shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I do not think things are going to be normal after this." We sat there in silence for a moment longer, both of us lost in thought. Finally, I got up, pulling my shirt back on, trying to ground myself in something familiar. I could hear the sound of the shower running in the bathroom, and the normalcy of it all only made the night feel even more surreal. Danny looked at me, his expression a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "So, are we going to talk about it? I mean, what if she wants to, keep doing this?" I took a deep breath, considering his words. A part of me was thrilled at the thought, but there was another part, a more cautious part, that was terrified of where all of this could lead. "I guess we will just have to see what she says," I replied, my voice calm, though my heart was racing. Just then, the bathroom door opened, and Diana emerged, looking refreshed, a soft smile on her lips as she glanced at us. There was no awkwardness in her gaze, no hesitation, only that same confidence that she had shown all night. "Well, boys," she said casually, as if we had just shared a normal night together, "thank you for being such wonderful company." She looked at each of us in turn, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. "I hope this does not make things complicated between us." Danny and I exchanged a glance, both of us shaking our heads. "No, not at all," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I think we're fine." "Good," she said, her smile widening. "Because I think we all needed a night like this." The way she said it made me feel like there was a hidden meaning, a promise of something more if we wanted it. Danny looked at me, a spark of hope in his eyes, as if he was thinking the same thing. As Diana turned to leave the room, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. "And if either of you ever feels like we should continue what we started, you know where to find me." The invitation was clear, and for a moment, I felt my heart skip a beat. Diana left the room, and the sound of her footsteps faded down the hall. Danny let out a long breath, looking at me with a mix of disbelief and excitement. "Dude, did that really just happen?" I nodded, still trying to wrap my mind around it all. "Yeah," I said softly. "Yeah, it did." We both sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of Diana's offer hanging in the air between us. I could tell that Danny was just as tempted as I was, that he was already imagining what it would be like to keep going, to see where this forbidden path would lead. As we left Diana's room and walked back downstairs, I could feel the sense of normalcy returning, yet everything felt different. It was like we had crossed some invisible line, stepping into a world where anything was possible, a world where we could explore our desires without judgment, as long as we kept it secret. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Danny and I went through the motions, but my mind kept drifting back to Diana, to the way her touch had felt, the way her eyes had sparkled with that mischievous glint. Every time I thought about her invitation, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with a hint of danger, like I was standing on the edge of something thrilling and terrifying at the same time. That evening, after Danny had gone home, I found myself alone in the house with Diana. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and the casualness of it all only made everything feel more surreal. I could barely meet her eyes, still caught up in the memory of the night before, wondering if she was thinking about it too. Finally, she looked up, her gaze meeting mine across the kitchen. "Jason, can we talk for a minute?" I swallowed, feeling a wave of anticipation mixed with nerves. "Sure." She motioned for me to sit down at the kitchen table, and I joined her, my heart racing as I waited for her to speak. "I know last night was a lot," she began, her tone calm but serious. "And I want to make sure that you are okay with everything, that you do not feel pressured or confused. I nodded, trying to find the right words. I am okay, I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. I mean, it was unexpected. But I am glad it happened. Diana's eyes softened, and I could see a hint of relief in her expression. I am glad you feel that way, she said, reaching across the table to place her hand over mine. And I want you to know that if you ever want to talk about it, or if you are ever unsure, you can come to me. No judgment, no pressure. Her hand was warm, her touch gentle, and in that moment, I felt a surge of gratitude for her understanding. Whatever happened next, I knew that we could face it together, that we could navigate this strange new territory without fear. Thank you, I said quietly, meeting her gaze. I appreciate it. She smiled, giving my hand a gentle squeeze. Good. I just wanted to make sure that you always have a choice. This is not something we have to do again if you are uncomfortable with it. But the look in her eyes told me that she was open to it if I was, that this was an option we could explore as long as we were both willing. As she pulled her hand back, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, mixed with the thrill of possibility. Whatever came next, I knew that this was something I wanted to pursue, that I was ready to see where this path would lead. In the days that followed, everything around me seemed to blur. My mind kept drifting back to that night, the moments we had shared, and the quiet invitation that Diana had left lingering in the air. Every time I replayed it in my mind, it felt unreal. I would catch myself staring into space, lost in thought, remembering every detail. Diana and I continued our routines as if nothing had happened, but there was an unspoken understanding between us now. It was like we shared a secret, a hidden connection that neither of us had to speak about to acknowledge. A few times, I would catch her looking at me across the room, her eyes glinting with that same mischievous smile, and my pulse would quicken. Then one evening, about a week later, Danny came over again. There was a kind of hesitation between us, an awareness of everything we had shared that we could not ignore. I could see it in his expression, in the way his gaze darted around, as if he was searching for Diana. He had not said anything about that night since it happened, and I could tell he was just as uncertain about where things stood. After a while, Diana came downstairs, looking as effortlessly beautiful as ever, her hair pulled back, a casual smile on her face. She greeted us both with that same warmth, but there was something different in the way she looked at Danny, a spark that told me she had not forgotten either. "Hey, Danny," she said, her voice smooth and inviting. "It is nice to see you again. How have you been?" Danny shifted, glancing at me before answering. "I have been good. Just, the usual." Diana's smile widened just a little, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Good. I am glad." The three of us settled in the living room, the conversation flowing easily, but there was an undercurrent that none of us could ignore. Every now and then, Diana would let her hand rest on my arm or lean just a little closer than necessary, and I could feel the tension building with each small touch. Finally, after a bit of casual conversation, Diana glanced at the clock and stood up. "I am going to grab a glass of wine. Would either of you like one?" Danny and I exchanged a quick look, both of us nodding, unsure of where this was leading but unwilling to turn back now. Diana disappeared into the kitchen, and Danny leaned over to me, his voice barely a whisper. Do you think she wants to?" He trailed off, clearly unsure how to finish the question. I shrugged, trying to keep my tone casual, though my heart was racing. "I do not know, man. But if she does, are you okay with it?" Danny hesitated, his gaze darting to the kitchen before he nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely audible. "I am." A moment later, Diana returned with 3 glasses, handing one to each of us before settling back down on the couch. She took a sip, her eyes flicking between Danny and me, a small smile playing on her lips. "So," she said, her voice soft, almost teasing. "I have been thinking about the other night, and I wanted to know if either of you had thought about it, too." Danny looked at me, his face turning red, but he nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah. I have thought about it." Diana's smile widened, and she turned to me, her gaze locking onto mine. "And you, Jason?" I swallowed, feeling the weight of her question. Yeah. I have thought about it, too." She nodded, satisfied, and set her glass down on the table, leaning back in her seat. Good. Because I have been thinking that maybe we could explore things a little further. But only if both of you are comfortable with it. I glanced at Danny, who gave me a quick nod, his eyes filled with a mix of anticipation and excitement. I looked back at Diana, my heart pounding in my chest. We are comfortable with it, I said, my voice quiet but certain. Diana's smile softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on my arm before turning to Danny. Then why do we not make ourselves comfortable? She stood up, holding out her hands to each of us, guiding us to follow her back up the stairs, her movements smooth and confident. This time, there was no hesitation, no lingering uncertainty. We knew where this was headed, and none of us were holding back. When we reached her room, Diana closed the door behind us, the air thick with anticipation. She moved between us with that same practiced ease, her touch light and deliberate, drawing us both in as she leaned closer, her lips brushing against mine before turning to Danny. Every touch, every glance, was electric, filling the room with an energy that I could feel deep in my bones. As the night went on, time seemed to slip away, each moment blending seamlessly into the next. Diana was in control, guiding us both, her touch igniting a fire in me that only grew stronger with each passing second. We were lost in the moment, caught up in a whirlwind of sensations that left me breathless, my heart racing with every touch, every whispered word. When the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, we lay there in silence, the three of us tangled together, the weight of the night settling over us. Diana's hand rested on my chest, her breathing slow and steady, and I could feel the warmth of Danny's presence beside me, both of us caught up in the same shared experience. Finally, Diana sat up, looking at each of us with a satisfied smile. You both did well, she said softly, her voice filled with a warmth that made me feel like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Danny and I exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had shared. There was a bond between us now, an understanding that went beyond words. As Diana stood, pulling her robe around herself again, she looked back at us, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. If either of you ever wants to continue this, you know where to find me. We nodded, both of us still too caught up in the moment to say anything. Diana left the room, and for a while, Danny and I just lay there, the reality of everything that had happened sinking in. Eventually, Danny broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think we will do this again? I shrugged, my mind still reeling. I do not know. But I would not mind if we did. Danny smiled, a hint of relief in his expression. Me neither. When we finally made our way back downstairs, Diana was in the kitchen, a casual smile on her face as she made coffee. She looked up when she saw us, her gaze warm and knowing, and for a moment, everything felt normal, as if we had not just shared a night that would change everything. Good morning, she said, her tone casual but with a hint of something deeper. Sleep well? We both nodded, and she laughed softly, handing each of us a mug. Well, you are welcome here any time. The rest of the morning passed in a comfortable silence, each of us content to let the memory of the night linger without needing to speak it aloud. It was an unspoken understanding, a quiet acceptance of everything we had shared. The next few days were a strange blend of normal routines and quiet moments filled with unspoken thoughts. Every time I was around Diana, I could feel the lingering heat of our shared experiences, like a secret tether between us that only grew stronger in silence. We didn't talk about that night, but her gaze would linger just a moment longer than usual, and a small, knowing smile would play on her lips when she thought I wasn't looking. Then there was Danny. When I saw him at school, things felt different. It was as if we shared a secret that no one else could ever understand. Sometimes we'd catch each other's eye in the hallway, and a flicker of that night would pass between us, both thrilling and unnerving. We hadn't talked about what we'd done, but I could sense he wanted to, that he was waiting for me to bring it up. Finally, one afternoon, Danny came over to my place, and we sat in my room, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. After a while, he looked over at me, his eyes serious. So, have you thought about, what happened? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. Yeah, I have. It's kind of hard not to, He looked down, picking at the threads on my bedspread. Do you think we're going to do it again? Like, she seemed pretty open to it. Do you want to? I took a deep breath, my mind racing with memories, with thoughts of Diana's touch, her voice, that intense connection we'd shared. Part of me wanted to dive right back into it, to feel the thrill all over again. But another part, the part that was cautious, wary of what it all meant, held me back. I don't know, I admitted. I mean, I want to. But, it's complicated, right? Like, what if this messes things up between us? Danny looked up, his gaze searching mine. Yeah, but maybe it doesn't have to be. Diana made it seem like it could just be something we all enjoy. No strings, no drama. I nodded, considering his words. It was tempting to think that we could keep it that simple, that this thing between us and Diana could stay private, untouched by the complications of real life. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that easy. What if one of us gets attached? I asked, voicing the thought that had been gnawing at me since that night. Danny hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door as if he expected Diana to appear at any moment. Then I guess we'd deal with it. I mean, we're all adults, right? We can handle this, unless you think it's already too much? Before I could answer, we heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I could see the same mixture of anticipation and nervousness in Danny's face. The door creaked open, and there was Diana, a small smile playing on her lips as she looked between the two of us. Hey, boys, she said casually, but there was a glimmer in her eyes, like she knew exactly what we had been talking about. Mind if I join you? We both nodded, and she stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. She settled down on the edge of the bed, her gaze calm and reassuring as she looked at us. I've been wondering if either of you wanted to talk about the other night. Danny and I exchanged a quick look, and I could see the same curiosity in his eyes. He spoke up first, his voice tentative. We were actually just talking about it. I guess we're both just wondering what comes next. Diana smiled, her expression gentle but serious. I want you both to know that this doesn't have to be complicated. I enjoyed our time together, and I'm open to continuing it, if that's what you both want. But only if you're both comfortable. I never want either of you to feel pressured or confused. Her words made my heart race, but they also brought a sense of calm, like she had somehow anticipated our every concern. I glanced at Danny, who was nodding, his expression thoughtful. I think we're both interested, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. But we're just not sure how this is supposed to work. Diana reached over, placing a comforting hand on my arm, then on Danny's. It works however we want it to. If we want to keep this simple, we can. If we decide to take a break, we can. There are no rules, except that we're honest with each other. Danny looked down, nodding slowly. That sounds good. I just don't want anything to change between us, you know? Diana's gaze softened, and she squeezed his arm gently. Nothing has to change, unless we want it to. We're exploring this together, and that means we all get to decide how far we go. Her words hung in the air, comforting and exhilarating all at once. It felt like she had just opened a door to a new world, one where we could navigate this strange, thrilling connection without fear. We didn't have to define it, to put a label on it, we just had to let it unfold, to see where it would lead. For the next few weeks, things continued in a delicate balance. Diana, Danny, and I spent time together, sometimes just talking, sometimes letting that unspoken tension guide us to quiet, intimate moments. It was like we had formed a small, private world that existed just for the three of us, hidden from everything and everyone else. Yet, as time went on, I started to notice small changes, subtle shifts in Danny's behavior, the way he would look at Diana when he thought I wasn't watching, the way he'd linger just a moment longer than necessary when he touched her. It was like he was being pulled deeper into this connection, and as much as I understood it, it made me wonder if we were all getting in over our heads. One evening, while Diana was out, Danny and I were sitting in my room, the weight of unspoken questions hanging between us. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes serious. Jason, do you think this is going to last? Like, do you think we're going to keep doing this? I hesitated, the question hitting closer to home than I'd expected. I don't know, I said honestly. I mean, I want to, but sometimes I wonder if we're just setting ourselves up for something we can't control. Danny nodded, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. I'd been wondering the same thing. It's hard to pull away, you know? I understood exactly what he meant. There was something magnetic about Diana, about the way she'd brought us together, that made it impossible to think about going back to the way things were before. But at the same time, I could feel the tension building, the unspoken questions, the feelings that neither of us were ready to confront. The next day, I found myself alone with Diana, sitting in the quiet of the living room as the sun dipped below the horizon. She looked over at me, her gaze thoughtful. "Jason, are you happy with how things are going?" she asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, but I could feel a hint of hesitation. Yes. I am. But I guess I'm just worried. About what happens if things get too complicated. Diana's smile softened, and she reached out, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. That's a fair concern. Relationships, connections, they all come with risks. But if we're honest, if we respect each other's boundaries, then I think we can keep things as simple as we want them to be. Her words calmed me, but they also made me realize how much I cared about keeping this connection intact, not just with Diana, but with Danny, too. I didn't want to lose this, didn't want to let fear or doubt get in the way. But deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning, that there were still questions, emotions, and uncertainties waiting beneath the surface. And as much as I tried to push them aside, I could feel them building, waiting for the moment they would finally break free. As time passed, the lines between us began to blur in ways none of us had anticipated. What had started as a thrilling, secret connection now felt like something deeper, something we couldn't easily explain or compartmentalize. The excitement was still there, but there was also a quiet intensity that none of us had expected. One evening, after Danny had left, Diana and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. The room was filled with the warm glow of the dimmed lights, and for a while, we just stood there, neither of us saying a word. Finally, she turned to me, her expression serious, a faint crease between her brows. "Jason," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. And I wanted to talk to you about where this is all going." I felt my heart skip a beat, sensing the weight of her words. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it, too," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. She took a deep breath, her gaze searching mine. "I care about you and about Danny, but I also know that this arrangement can't stay the way it is forever. Eventually, it's going to affect our lives in ways we may not be ready for." I nodded, her words hitting close to home. Deep down, I had known that this was only temporary, that eventually, we would have to make a choice. But hearing her say it out loud made it feel real in a way that I hadn't fully processed. "So, what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Diana's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing a comforting hand on my arm. "I think we need to decide what this really means to each of us. If it's just an experience we're sharing, a memory we'll look back on, then maybe it's time to bring it to a close before anyone gets too attached." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a pang of something that I couldn't quite name. I didn't want this to end, didn't want to let go of what we had. But I also knew she was right, that if we didn't address this now, it could lead to heartache down the line. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang, and my heart jumped. Danny stepped into the kitchen, his eyes lighting up as he saw the two of us, but his smile faded as he sensed the seriousness in the air. "What's going on?" he asked, his gaze flicking between us. Diana looked at him, her expression kind but resolute. "Danny, we were just talking about where we're all headed with this. I think it's time we have an honest conversation about what we each want, so that no one ends up hurt." Danny looked down, clearly caught off guard. "Oh. I see." There was a long silence as the three of us stood there, each of us grappling with our own thoughts. Finally, Danny spoke, his voice low and uncertain. I don't know what I want," he admitted, glancing at me as if looking for reassurance. "I just know that I don't want to lose what we have." Diana nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I feel the same way. But we need to be clear about our expectations. If this is just something fun, something fleeting, then we should keep it that way and not let it become something more." I could feel the tension building, a weight pressing down on my chest as I realized that we were standing on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Finally, I took a deep breath, speaking from a place of honesty that surprised even me. I think, maybe we should just keep it as a memory, something special that we shared. I mean, I don't want it to get messy between us. Danny looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that's for the best. Diana nodded, her gaze soft and understanding. Thank you for being honest, both of you. This is something I'll always treasure, but I think it's best if we keep it as a part of our past, something beautiful that we'll always remember. Her words were gentle, but they carried a finality that left me feeling both relieved and heartbroken. I realized then that this was the end not of our connection, but of the path we had been on together. We would always share that bond, that memory, but we would let it live in the past, a moment frozen in time. That night, as Danny and I left Diana's house, we walked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It felt strange, bittersweet, but there was also a sense of peace in knowing that we had made the right choice. As we reached the end of the street, Danny looked over at me, a small, sad smile on his face. Well, I guess this is it. I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness but also a quiet sense of acceptance. Yeah, but it was worth it, wasn't it? He nodded, a glimmer of warmth returning to his gaze. Yeah. It was. And with that, we parted ways, each of us carrying the memory of that time, that experience, tucked away in a safe corner of our minds. We would move on, find new paths, new experiences, but the memory of those nights would always be there, a reminder of the strange, beautiful connection we had shared. In the end, it was a story that would live only between the three of us, a secret, a shared bond, a chapter that we would revisit from time to time, knowing that it had changed us all in ways we could never fully explain.